It's great to see you guys. I know that I saw you at session 2, and this is what, session 13? So I'm sure you guys had some really good times together, and I know that it's the official session 13, and I know that there have been other unofficial sessions, maybe going until midnight, 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm glad to see you guys. So today we have a great panel. We're going to be talking about mentoring and supporting women in the workplace. And with me, I have fantastic leaders who happen to be women, and their bios, illustrious bios, are in your BofA app. But let me very quickly introduce, first of all, Wendy Cutler. Yes. Thank you. Our very own, we're very proud. Wendy Cutler is Vice President and Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, otherwise known as ASPI. She has more than 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. So she's formerly with the USTR. Before the Asia Society, I used to watch her on TV. And as many of you know, she's a very tough negotiator, very fair negotiator as well. So we'll be hearing from her in terms of some negotiation techniques maybe, as well as other things that she's passionate about, which of course includes women's empowerment. Next to me, I have Tamao Sasada, President and Representative Director of Bank of America Securities. She advises clients on their various strategic needs, ranging from M&A opportunity to capital raising. She's also a lawyer. And by the way, so Tamao, you are an Asia 21 as well.
Yes, I will.
Yes. So you are a class of
2007.
2007. Yeah. So she's one of us as well. Okay. Your classmates are very happy. So Wenchi Yu, I should also mention that you're also an Asia 21.
Yes.
Which class are you?
11.
2011. Okay. Is anybody here okay? Right. So Wenchi is with the Ash Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. She specializes in cross-border and market access strategies between the U.S. and Asia. I'm Claire Chino. I am on the board of Itochu Corporation, which is a conglomerate. So you now know their official titles, but I thought it would be really good to really dive into deeper conversation about their personal journey. First of all, really how they became the leader that they are today. So I want to perhaps start with you, Wendy, if it's okay. Can you tell us more about yourself? As I said, I know that you have been a tremendous negotiator. Maybe you can share with us some negotiation techniques, and if there is such a thing as whether, in some respects, women are a better negotiator than others.
Well, first, thank you so much. I'm honored to be on this panel, even though I'm not an Asia 21 winner. But
you're a mentor to us, and you're definitely a mentor to me. So.
But I'm working for the Asia Society, so that, and I just want to say this program is so special and integral to all the work we do in the Asia Society. And I know in the Asia Society Policy Institute, where I work, we do reach out to many of you to participate in our programs, to provide us input. And, you know, given how many years this program has been going on, your credentials, your career journeys also are just so impressive. And we hope looking forward, we can just integrate you more and more into our work. So thanks to all of you, and I'm sure you're all enjoying being together in person again. I had the fortune of joining the Asia 21 program when it was held in Korea, where Claire and I shared a stage, and so now I'm honored to be back on the stage with you, Claire. So my journey, basically, I'll start with, I knew I wanted to work in international trade when I graduated with my master's from Georgetown University. And if you wanted to work on international trade in Washington, D.C., you wanted to end up in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative. That was kind of the elite kind of go-to negotiating group. But like anything in one's career, they don't just take people off the streets or out of school. You kind of have to prove yourself. And so I joined the Commerce Department, but I always kept my eye on how I could work with USTR folks and get that visibility. And so it took 5 years, but I was hired by USTR and negotiated for about 30 years, including multilateral negotiations in the World Trade Organization, bilateral negotiations with Japan. I negotiated the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement. And then at the end of my career, I worked on the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a senior negotiator. Unfortunately, we left that agreement, but my hat's off to my colleagues in Japan, who then turned around and worked with the other countries and put it into effect. Through all of these negotiations, I just learned a lot. And, you know, people always ask me, like, were you trained in negotiation? And no, you know, we were not. And so how do you learn how to negotiate? And it's like anything in life. You learn by watching others and figuring out, you know, what works for them, what doesn't work, what fits into your style. You learn by your mistakes, okay, your successes and mistakes. And I've made a number of mistakes in different negotiations through the years. But once you make one of those big mistakes, you kind of don't repeat it, right? You kind of learn from it and you avoid it. And also, you know, just experience like anything in life. And by the time I felt that when I was negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, I knew what I was doing then, and I'd kind of seen it all. And so I felt like at the negotiating table, I was pretty, you know, self-confident and experienced by then. And so I would just say I feel like I had a great, you know, journey with the government. By the time TPP was concluded, I knew I wanted another career in the private sector, frankly, and I knew if I didn't leave at that point, I would never leave. And my boss at that time, who was the U.S. Trade Representative, Mike Froman, he really wanted me to stay. And I remember I'd accepted a job at the Asia Society, and I was going to start that, my last day at USTR was going to be that Friday. We finished TPP, concluded the negotiations that Monday before. And when I was leaving the airport to go back to Washington in a van with Ambassador Froman at that time, he asked me, well, you know, can you just stay for 6 more months? Because we're going to need to get this through Congress. And I knew then, like, that I needed, if I didn't leave, I would never leave, right? Because you get kind of comfortable, you're good at it, you like what you do. But I knew it was time for my second act, and I was really fortunate at that time. Josette Sheeran was the president of the Asia Society, and she had worked at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, so she had asked me to open up her Washington office. And I told Froman, you know, I have a commitment. And he said, don't worry about that. I can call Josette, and, you know, she'll be fine if you stay with us another 6 months or a year. And I'm like, no, I don't, you know, it's really time for me to move on. And then he said, well, you know, you don't have to work 80 hours a week. You know, you can work part-time for me. And I said, well, what does that look like? You work 80 hours a week. Like, how do you even work part-time for someone like you? So I kind of, you know, stood my ground, joined the Asia Society, and now I've been there 7 years. Again, I didn't expect to be at the Asia Society that long, but it's just been an incredible journey at the Asia Society as the Policy Institute has grown under the leadership of Kevin Rudd. We just opened a new China Center. I'm sure I'll be talking more about that. Our staff is expanding, and we're getting into a lot of new areas of, you know, of research and of, you know, producing policy papers. So it's a really fun time, and particularly given all the uncertainties in the world, I think think tanks just have a really important role to play. And I'm going to stop here and just say Asia in particular has, you know, that's the place to be in the world. That's where things are happening, and that's where I think history is going to be made, you know, going forward.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Yes. We have been talking a lot over the last 4 days on leadership amongst different values. And you did mention that you have been bilateral negotiations, but also multilateral negotiations. And, how do you actually navigate through leading a negotiation when there is not only one other value across the table, but different values? What are some of the things that you might have actually tried in bringing people together? Is it actually aligning with those people who have same values and then working on those without those values? How do you actually negotiate that?
Let's just say there's a lot going on, including values, but there's a lot of other stuff going on as well. And sometimes we probably never did as great job in terms of recognizing a lot of the kind of cultural nuances among different delegations. And when you talk about, when I mentioned earlier, making mistakes, I mean, there are times when I made mistakes, cultural mistakes, not recognizing the importance of something for a certain culture. But it's interesting, I always think of, when President Trump took office, one of the first things he did was exit the TPP agreement, which was an agreement at that time between 12 countries. And in the executive order, when he said he was going to exit, he said, we're going to do bilateral negotiations going forward. And, we don't want to do negotiations with lots of countries. And his view was, and I think it was based on being, a real estate guy, was that, you get more out of a bilateral negotiation, particularly if you're the United States and you're with a small country, and you can kind of get what you want. But in reality, I would argue there are some, there are definitely some pros and benefits of bilateral negotiations. But multilateral negotiations or negotiations with groups of countries give you all new types of negotiating leverage, particularly if you can build coalitions with other countries. So therefore, it's not the U.S. saying you have to do this. It's more that a group of countries are saying that you need to do this. And, I remember during TPP with a country like Vietnam, that was important, that it wasn't, they could go back to their capital and say, all these other countries have agreed to do this. I think we need to do this as well, versus, going and saying, gosh, the U.S. wants one more thing. And so, I think the real estate world is very different than the world of government-to-government negotiations. And maybe I can just make one other point on this, and that is there are two key differences when you negotiate government-to-government as opposed to, let's just saying, real estate. You're going to need to work with these countries again, right? You don't just end the negotiation and you can move on like you can in real estate, right? And so if you're really mean to a country or make unreasonable demands or a negotiation ends up in a bad place, it's hard to go back to them 3 months later and say, hey, I need your support on this. And so countries have long memories, and I think that's, a distinguishing feature. Also, these agreements, government-to-government agreements, particularly trade negotiations, they need to be win-win negotiations, right? Both sides have to be able to go home and to say what they achieved. Because if the other side feels that they didn't get anything, there's payback time when they have to implement the agreement. And they'll find ways either not to implement it, or sometimes they can't even get the domestic support to put the agreement into place. So win-win is really important. And I remember through the years having to tell some of my new political bosses, be careful how you talk about these agreements when they're done. Make sure that you're giving space to the other countries to be able also to underscore what they got out of the deal, because that's key for a lasting deal. I'm going to let the other panelists speak. Sorry.
Thank you so much. And by the way, I actually forgot to introduce you guys to the new class, but this year's class is 40 members. More than 35 of them are here in Tokyo, and more than 20 countries are represented. And it's a very impressive group of people, and I think they're going to be making, long-lasting friendship. And I'm actually very, very happy about that. But turning to now Tamao, so you have been leading this huge organization, Bank of America, here in Japan. And if you can tell us about your personal journey in how you became the leader that you are today.
Well, thank you, Claire. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and it's such an honor to come back. And that's amazing to have so many distinct individuals again. And I haven't met any of you yet, but look forward to spending some time. So thank you. So maybe, yes, I can start with the personal journey. I've been on this role for the last 3 years as a country exec for Bank of America, but formerly known as Merrill Lynch. As you might recall, during financial crisis, the two institutions were merged, and I have been with Merrill, so my career history has been 24 years with the same institution, but halfway through during the financial crisis, Merrill was bought by Bank of America across the platform. It's been an interest. So before that, maybe stepping back, I graduated from university in Japan, studied law, and always had an aspiration to do something internationally. So went to New York and I worked at a corporate law firm, two firms actually, for 3 years. Immediately before that, I actually had an opportunity to work at Claire's company, Itochu, legal department. So that was sort of a pre-Merrill background. But I went to New York working for a U.S. law firm, knowing that it's going to be a very competitive dynamics. Not so much of a man-woman thing, but because English is not my first language. I mean, I did grow up outside of Japan a little bit. So that was interesting experience, but certainly a growing experience. But had an opportunity approached by Merrill Lynch at the time, and this time was to work for a U.S. financial institution in Japan. It was a bit of a surprise because it's a U.S. company. I expected that it's going to be very diverse, and people had a diverse mindset. And it did, but it was very much of a Japanese, the male-driven sort of a financial culture. During that time, the interesting aspect was when Merrill Lynch and Bank of America got together, I realized that the two firms both had a strong D&I culture, diversity and inclusion culture. So both firms were really trying hard to elevate positioning of women within Japan. So that was a good part. But what was kind of hard navigating this was because the two institutions had completely different set of corporate culture. Merrill International, it was a global footprint. Bank of America, of course, global, but it was very U.S.-centric institutions. So when we were merged, a lot of people in Japan as well as outside of Japan were a little bit concerned, the tough times, and thinking what was going to happen. But gradually in doing so, again, D&I, or even recently ESG for that matter as well, it was really embedded in integrating the two cultures together. So that was sort of a little bit about my career history. And then my background has always been on the investment banking side. So is to deal with Japanese corporates who wants to be global, who wants to grow outside of Japan. So we help them raise capital or advise on M&A strategic side of it. So I've been in the private sector for most of my career, getting where I am today. Thank you.
So, I mean, Tamao-san is such a successful and very famous person here in Japan, and I was extremely delighted to see the news article when she became Japan head 3 years ago. There were articles everywhere, but I've known Tamao really for the last more than 10 years ago, and she's always been a very impressive person. And it's not just within my company, but everybody talks about how wonderful she is, what a great, business person she is. And by the way, included in that is her commitment really to her clients, even on weekends. I know that you were playing golf yesterday, and we were actually talking about this business development. It still involves it used to be a lot of drinking, a lot of golf playing, especially here in Japan. How do you keep up with that? And how important is that for somebody like me who doesn't drink or play golf?
I don't drink much, but I can. But I think playing golf is it's a very peculiar to Japanese culture, maybe Korea to some extent as well. But interestingly, it's definitely useful for perhaps more senior, the older generations. Maybe I shouldn't say older, but when I say when I interact with a much younger crowd, I have clients that are in their 30s, the entrepreneur CEOs, startup CEOs, tech companies. They don't place so much value in playing golf on the weekends, and so you have different ways of building relationships. So it's an interesting perspective. It's a very diverse client set and different values depending on the generations as well. So again, different D&I perspective, right?
Thank you, Tamao. Now turning to Wenchi. Can you tell us how you became the leader that you are today?
Thank you. I always feel embarrassed if we have to talk about ourselves, especially after 2 and 3, so many accomplished women. So I think maybe the way I'll talk about it is to talk about my bosses along the way, because we're really talking about mentoring, supporting women in the workplace, and what I have learned from all of them. And each one of them is so different. That has taught me so much. So I'll start, I was born in Taiwan, and I grew up in Taiwan. And if you ask a 15, 16-year-old Wenchi, what do you want to do when you grow up? I had this vision of me working somehow in a UN organization, in a war-torn, poverty-stricken village out there helping refugees or people who need help, right? That was the vision of myself. So I know when I was at a young age that I want to be involved in international affairs, I want to be helpful to people, I want to create impact. But if you want to ask me what exactly do I want to be, especially at that time, being from Taiwan, it's impossible to work for a UN organization for obvious political reasons. So I became very involved in political activism at that time when Taiwan was going through sort of the democratic transition. It was, the first presidential election and the first time that, a ruling party in a powerful position for more than 5 decades was going to be overthrown, basically. So I did my internship in college and, other things with a political party. And my first boss at that time, she was very young too. She was only in her mid-20s. Truly became my first boss and first sort of mentor and friend and almost like a sister. And, she was the one who was in, I can't remember, BKIM was in 2006 or 7? 6. Okay, 6, okay. BKIM Shao, Asia 21, 2006, and she's now the de facto Taiwan ambassador to Washington, D.C. She was the one who nominated me, actually, into Asia 21 a couple years later after her. And then I came to the U.S. and became an American, through education and work, etc. And then my second boss, who literally has become my mother, American mother, I would say, Ambassador Milan Verveer. I joined a nonprofit organization after school. It's called Vital Voices, which was started by Hillary Clinton. Wendy would know this well. It started as an initiative in the Clinton administration as, a U.S. government effort to really support women in democratic transition, especially in that time, post-Soviet time, right? There's a lot of support that needed sort of U.S. support. And then its spin-off became a nonprofit organization to really support women's leadership around the world. And so I joined the organization, very luckily sort of, completely changed my trajectory in terms of my career. Got very involved in a lot of issues, started actually in working on violence against women, trafficking in persons in Eastern Europe. So that was the first region I was involved in, Eastern Europe, post-Soviet time. Ukraine, Russia, all these countries is usually where I travel to. What I learned from, again, first Bi Kim Hsiao was just unflinching commitment to a cause. Till today, you'll see that in her, and her devotion to something that she believes in, right? That's first. Milan, anyone who knows her and Wendy knows her well, the warmest person you'll ever meet. However, she's so politically savvy that if she meets her enemy, the enemy will become her ally, right? So she is just someone who never needs any formal power title, but she has this tacit, I would say tacit leadership and power that brings everyone along with her and go with her. And so I followed her to the State Department with, Secretary Clinton at that time as a political appointee. So during the Obama administration, actually working on women's issues for 4 years. The best time in my life, I can tell you. The pay was terrible, but the impact and I would say the satisfaction is just something, I have not felt since leaving the government. But that's different because when you work for such a powerful person who cares deeply about those issues, right? You're given the free rein pretty much to do almost everything. So every time when the secretary is on the road, she's gonna say, I want a program, I want something related to women and gender. So you work like 24/7, but your issues are always gonna be on top of the agenda. So we were able to do a lot of creative things, and Wendy, of course, very supportive from USTR. And by the way, she's known in Washington, D.C. as the top female trade negotiator, right? So we always wanted to involve her. Not only in D.C., elsewhere as well, here in Japan as well. And of course, we always wanted to involve Wendy as well, who also at that time, not only as a top negotiator, but not... I think all of you probably have experienced that, a lot of women in leadership positions are actually very shy about their sort of female identity. But Wendy was not one of them. She's actually very proud of her female identity and always wanted to be involved. That actually says a lot about, her confidence and security about her identity. And so what I learned, again, from sort of my government days is, especially working for Secretary Clinton, is, she's a public figure, everyone knows. But there are a lot of other sides that people haven't seen, right? So I think there's a certain public image about her. Whatever it is, she's actually, again, an extremely warm person, caring person who cares deeply about her staff. But also, I would say always the most intelligent in the room, right? It's hard to actually find someone else who's more intelligent if you're in the room together. And oftentimes, excuse my language, I like to say she has the biggest balls than any other man. Like she just, her tenacity as well as never backing down, and always, every time she's knocked down, she stands up again. It's hard not to respect her, whether you like her or not. And these are sort of, the things I've learned from my various bosses. That was sort of my public sector, nonprofit sector learning. Then I switched to the private sector when I left the government. I joined Goldman Sachs as the head of the Asia philanthropy program here. I was based in Beijing. Lots of adjustments, I have to say, because if you think about all my bosses previously, they were all very caring, warm kind of people. Switching to the banking and finance environment, that's really different. First of all, usually when you walk into the room, it's mostly men. I have to say, in the beginning, I was very uncomfortable because I came from a world where I walk into the room, it's mostly women. And so, but my direct boss, I had two bosses at that time. direct boss was based in New York. She's also quite well known in Washington, D.C., Dina Powell. And she later on became the Deputy National Security Advisor. Very, very different leadership style. I think because I'm a Democrat, she's Republican. And what I learned from her is her brazen ambition. And just, she doesn't even hide about it. And that's something she knows that's what she wants, and she pursues it. And she's shamelessly about it. And there's something beautiful, actually, about that kind of personality, later I find, because she gets things done, and she's fearless. And my other boss, who's actually not a woman, a man, and I had never had a male boss before at that time, and he, based in the region, is the Asia chair for Goldman Sachs. And his leadership style is so different in the sense that he's so intense, so aggressive, nothing I've seen before. And first time ever in my life I've been screamed at was by Mark, right? And you could see fire in his eyes when he screamed at you and then swear in the entire time. I was thinking, I was quite, I would say, like, surprised and startled by that kind of style. But then later on, I learned sort of, being nice and kind has its merit. But sometimes if you really want to get things done, whether you agree or not, that's another way of getting things done, right? So I guess my point is, all the way through that, what I learned is that there's so many leadership styles, so many different types of bosses, and I'm lucky enough that everyone has sort of taken me under their wing, so I was able to really move from one thing to the next and really buy their endorsement and support. Till today, I'm still friends with every single one of them. I can always get a recommendation letter or anything from any one of them, and I'm truly grateful for that. And of course, later on, when I joined a startup and then now doing things on my own, I often think back, I've been lucky to have different bosses who really taught me different things, but who am I really? Like, who am I? I'm not trying to be Hillary, and as much as I admire her, but I don't want to become someone like her, right? For various reasons. I'm not Milan, I'm not Dina Powell, I'm not Mark Schwartz, I'm not Big Him Shao, but who am I? And I'm still searching for that. And this is also one of the reasons why I love Asia Society or Asia 21, because it's a network that allows me to actually look at everyone else and what everyone's path is like and really think about, at the end of the day, it's a self-discovery sort of path.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Wenchi. It's really true that when you're in a room full of men, and the other day we were actually in an executive meeting at my company, and prior to that I was in New York. So I only returned to Japan in June of this year, and up until that time, everybody was diverse, right? I didn't really think about me being a woman or Asian or Japanese or whatever. But then all of a sudden to come back to Japan in a setting where there were 400 people, 397 of them were Japanese men, only 3 female executives, and I was one of them. And it made me really very much a minority, right? So, Wenchi, what you said about who am I kind of, lost thinking about that, because to me, all of a sudden I was a super minority. But Wendy, I want to now turn to you. You have been very passionate about actually mentoring others. And by the way, when on day 1 or 2, the session 2 that we had together with this class of 2022, where they talked about leadership, most of them actually talked about the importance of empowerment. And I believe that you're very passionate about empowering women, and in particular women in Korea and in Japan and in other Asian countries. So can you tell us about how you came about setting up this program and what results you have seen as well?
Sure, and I think I can really build on what you just said, because during my negotiating career, I negotiated mainly with North Asian countries, so Japan, Korea, and China. And probably the turning point in my career was negotiating with Korea a free trade agreement. And the Koreans are some of the most toughest negotiators in the world. That's their reputation, but it's very male. And I remember, I'd go to Seoul with my team was about 100 people working in lots of different issues, and we had a fair number of women. And the Korean side was basically, let's just say, of the 198 men and 2 women. And one of the women just became trade minister recently, and now she's a former trade minister, but very male oriented. And what happened to me during that negotiation was a very tough negotiation. And my bosses, not only my bosses, I think the Japanese, everyone in the world thought, why are we even negotiating a free trade with Korea? They were so protectionist at that point, and there was a feeling that this was going to fail. And so at my level at that time in the U.S. government, I was given a lot of responsibility because my bosses had other stuff to do. They didn't think this thing was going to succeed. So Wendy, go ahead, get as far as you can. And if I can just pass on anything about my career, it was I knew that there was something going on and that this was a turning point in Korea. And it was an incredible opportunity. And I worked really hard over a short period of time with my counterpart, who was very committed to do this. And we were able to reach success. But what happened during the negotiation for me was really interesting, too, because a lot of the prior female negotiators that had worked with Korea in the trade field were known as being very aggressive, the former USTR Carla Hills, they called her the Iron Lady. And so when I was negotiating, I started smiling, and all of a sudden that became a really big deal in Seoul. Is this a new kind of woman? Can we trust her, right? And because a lot of times people will say being a woman can work to your disadvantage. And it made me kind of special, and I kind of was seeing, I was experiencing just an incredible, transformation in Korea. But also for me personally, I was learning as a woman kind of how to use being a woman to kind of advance, the interest of my country, but also to reach an agreement with Korea. And, it's just again, a fascinating but extremely, tough negotiating period. But then what happened was a lot of these young women in Korea, right, they couldn't believe that the U.S. would put a woman in charge of such an important endeavor. And in Korea, this was an extremely important negotiation. Front page news whenever we were in Seoul, lots of attention. And as a result, there were articles of young women being quoted, "I want to be Wendy Cutler." And I'm what's this about? Anyway, as a result of this, when I joined the Asia Society, and I recognized that more and more women were entering the ranks, not only in Korea, but in the negotiating ranks in Japan and other countries, how could I pay back? How could I, really, give back to these people and help and mentor these women? Because in these societies, there aren't a lot of senior women who they can look up to. I think, when you were talking about your career working with incredible women like Milan or Hillary Clinton, in these societies, there are very few of these women. And so through this program I'm implementing through the Asia Society, I'm bringing groups of women either to the United States for a 10-day kind of boot camp negotiation, but also doing this through webinars and trying to establish networks among these women, but also helping them build confidence, sharpen their negotiating skills, learn more about trade policy, but also learn about women's empowerment issues. And so through our Asia Society Network, we've been able to meet with some incredible women, not only on our board, but Asia 21 folks. Claire, you met with one of the Japanese groups last year. And when people talk about their journeys, a lot of these women, I'm just like, they'll say after we have a survey, and they'll say, like, I don't feel as alone now. I feel like hearing these successful women who had to go through a lot of these same ups and downs and a lot of the same family challenges, or being in a meeting and no one's listening to you. It's something I'm doing that I feel really passionately about, but I think it's just really important to kind of give back, okay? And that's through this program. Hopefully, I'm touching some of these women in Asia. Now, what I always make clear to the United States, I'm not like training better negotiators. You're going to get more from the United States. That's not the purpose of the program, but to get these women more, to build their self-confidence, to sharpen their negotiating skills, and to really kind of be able to learn from senior women in the United States.
That's very interesting what you talked about, the smiling bit. I just have to give this anecdote. I was in the former West Germany as a student, and I was smiling a lot. And one day, my German friend kind of looked at me and said, and to me, he wasn't smiling at all. And I said, "Why aren't you smiling when I am smiling?" And he said, "Actually, smiling is not an echo. You don't have to smile back at you." And I was like taken aback, but very interesting. Anyway, so Tamao, by the way, I'm not generalizing about the Germans. It's just one episode that I wanted to share with you. So Tamao, I want to come back to you. You talked about the diversity of cultures, these two organizations, Merrill Lynch and Bank of America. And you, of course, as a leader, had this challenge of making sure that going forward, it was going to thrive as one culture. Can you talk about the cultural, integration? What you had to do in order to, have these two fantastic organizations now become one fantastic organization?
Yeah, I think it's I don't know how I can say this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but it was an interesting process because our company CEO, Brian Moynihan, he wanted to make sure, coming out of very difficult times, I don't know if you can recall 12 years ago, Lehman crisis or financial crisis, wanting to make sure that the unified entity he creates are a great place to work, right? How do we create a great place to work? I think that the foremost important thing was to create an inclusive culture, no matter where you are and what you do across different LOBs, maybe serving different type of clients, large corporates or financial institutions or government entities or retail investors or retail customers. So that was a lot of the focus that has been put from the top of the house. But I think in Japan, what we wanted to make sure is that the people feel very happy for who they are. So there are a lot of programs that we had internally making sure. So Japan is such a homogeneous society. So when we talk about diversity and bringing in the different perspective, the focus oftentimes is placed on women. So from that perspective, we always highlighted how important it is to have more women on the platform. So now it's about 45% women on the platform. But interestingly, when it goes up to the senior level, the number goes down. And then when you look at client-facing roles, the number goes down. So in investment banking division, it's about 20 to 30% women versus middle offices or back offices or the control functions, women's ratio goes up. So I can resonate a lot of things that Wenchi and Wendy said when she walks into the boardroom or the meeting room at Goldman Sachs, she was the only woman. We've gone through that sort of experience a lot in our company. But the important thing from that perspective was obviously the number goes up, but we create an environment that people can really voice people can really voice their minds, make sure that we have a place where people are not afraid of making statements or what they think about business strategy or clients, because people bring in different perspective, and in doing so, we actually make ourselves stronger and better. So that sort of ideas are repeated over and over from the top of the house. And when it comes to Japan, I made sure of that with my colleagues as well. How do we create an inclusive environment? The other thing that leadership thing, Wendy, you talked about making mistakes and how important it is to learn from that. And I think that's incredibly important, regardless of men or women, because we work as a team, and when we lose, unfortunately, sometimes we lose together. So the people that are in the managerial or leadership roles, wanting to make sure that the people underneath you feel like, you have their back, making sure that, and then I do that all the time, but, people feel empowered from that perspective. So I'm throwing in different ideas, but men and women or women to women mentor or supporting women program. So I think from our company perspective, navigating these unifying different cultures, now it is integrated. That's why I think we changed the name from Merrill Lynch to completely to BofA and Bank of America. But in doing so, a lot of efforts have taken place, and that's across the organization or from the top of the house.
Thank you so much. There is a lot happening on the corporate governance front. So, for example, in Japan, there is this movement that for listed companies, you actually have to disclose not only your financial results going forward, but your human capital asset and human capital asset management, including, for example, the ratio of women there are in your organization, which of course is a trend that's going on around the world, including in the United States. And as a securities house, you know that, and I'm sure you're advising clients on that as well. Can you touch upon that a little bit?
Yes, I think we're trying to show by examples. In our company, the board is very diverse. Bank of America, it's ethnically diverse, but also there are 30% women. And the managerial level at the global level, it's 40% at the senior women are there. But in Japan, interestingly, when I was appointed as president, a lot of clients, did the typical thing of sending me orchid flowers and called me, and that was really nice of them. But a lot of them said, "Can you come and talk to us about how you built a diverse culture, or how you elevate it, how you try to elevate women?" Because our clients, my clients are traditional Japanese clients, and these are large corporates, that they're trying to do the same thing, Claire, because there is a strong government push, and corporate governance code specifies the requirements. But it is very difficult from their perspective to make sure that those women stay. So the ratio is much lower, and how do they do that is a question that they come to us. And then in doing so, I often talk about male sponsorship or male advocacy. Make sure that not only at the top, but the sort of a general level, the mid-manager level, male executives would also support the women in their team to be elevated. So a lot of things that I share with my clients. The other thing is that on the women's side as well, a lot of women are afraid in Japan still that when they're given the role, they said, unless they are 95% sure that they can take on the roles, they have a tendency to say, "Oh no, I can't do it. I need 1 more or 2 more years to challenge to this elevated role." So I say to the corporate CEOs or the Japanese executives that please, push them, and please let them know that you have their backs to support them going through their career. In doing so, they can create more bench of a women at a little more senior level, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Tamao. So we actually have been, Wenchi and I have been talking about this. Listed companies, because of stakeholder pressure or just the way things are moving in the world, they are thinking more about diverse culture, the importance of, for example, having more women on the board, more independent directors on the board, the disclosure requirements that I talked about. But in a sense, listed companies are really quite privileged in being able to do that. But it is really the small and medium-sized enterprises that are having maybe hard times wanting to do, I guess, the right thing. So Wenchi, do you want to touch upon that and talk about that?
Yeah, I think I'll start with public companies because I think still, they play a major role in sort of influencing corporate behavior. So for those who actually follow it, in 2018 is when California passed the very first law that basically requires all public companies that, on the board, there needs to be at least one female board member by 2019, and by the end of 2021, depending on the number of your board members. So if you have at least 4 board members, then at least one female, 5, 2, 6, 3, right? And these are sort of regulatory requirements. And there's actually a penalty. If you don't follow that, then, you're fined for like 100,000 K to 300,000 K for a second violation. And the state of California is required to publish in a report every year. And then NASDAQ also, last year started requiring all their listed companies to disclose their diversity statistics. And this includes gender as well as race. And I think, if you look at some of the numbers right now in the United States, it's not doing that bad compared to 10, 20 years ago. I think according to some organization by the end of 2020, 28% of board members in the United States are actually female, right, in terms of total number. And 66% of corporate boards have at least 3 or more female board members. So that's true improvement compared to even just 10 years ago. Whether it's regulatory requirement or, the numbers I just shared, it's really a reflection of, I would say, years or even decades of social activism around, how do we actually do corporate governance better, right? Diversity is one part of it. There are many other aspects of good corporate governance, but diversity, everyone has started to realize, not diversity for the sake of diversity, but it brings into different perspectives, right? So it helps you think about how to make decisions better because there may be a blind spot, right? Because the way people think is different, and whether it's gender or it's different racial background, your upbringing and all that, it's just taking all things into consideration. But what's interesting is you'll see this kind of approach, which is more regulatory requirement type. And there's been pushback, and that is the reality. So just several months ago, the law I just mentioned in California was actually challenged by a court in California, in LA, basically pushing back and saying, this kind of gender requirement, quota requirement, actually is discriminatory, right, against the other sex. So it actually violates the equality protection kind of law. So that's currently being debated, basically. So I think, there's been a lot of sort of quota, whether it's on the board or other, even affirmative action, in the United States, lots of sort of similar conversations around what is the government's role when it comes to things like this, right? Should we make it a mandate or in terms of requirement, top down, or should we let the industry come up with their own standards and make it as a social norm? And so there's peer pressure rather than, and everyone sort of voluntarily does that rather than a legal requirement. I don't take a strong stance on it, but I do think it sort of sparks, conversations in different societies, and certainly it also depends on the society, in terms of the social context. If your society is ready for a certain approach, that's better, but certain societies perhaps not. But beyond that, I think in addition to sort of publicly listed companies, which obviously plays a really important role because usually people look at Fortune 500 companies as an example. But the truth is the majority of the economy is actually SMEs, right? So these are the organizations that don't, as we were discussing before, that don't have the luxury and the resources to do a lot of thinking and also implementing programs like this. So how do we actually make sure and incentivize those organizations, because that's where most people work in, to actually want to implement those principles? I think that's sort of the next challenge that we're confronting.
Thank you very much. I, by the way, forgot to mention at the beginning that we want to, of course, have you guys participate in this conversation too. So, think of a question or two while I actually come to the panelists for their last question. So, Wendy, what's in it for the future in terms of women's empowerment?
So yesterday, in Japan, the conference called WOW, not WOW, the World Assembly on Women was held, and I attended the day's deliberations. And I think a common theme among women from all over the world who came here was that things seem to be moving in the right direction, but more work needs to be done. And so I think when I think of these issues, I think of, certain countries are taking incremental steps, other countries are taking, bolder steps. Governments can do some of the work, but private sector plays a really important role as well. And it also came up yesterday, there was discussion about just the importance of families and culture, that even if the government and private sector kind of gets it right and, has all these programs and incentives, a lot of it still needs to, it can only really work if the cultural norms change. And, that takes time, and particularly in certain Asian societies that are very male-dominated, it's going to take time. And so I'm an optimist, and so I look at, things moving in the right direction. The other interesting thing that came out of the conference yesterday, a number of women spoke about, the impact of COVID. And COVID, in a number of respects, really set back kind of the gender, or let's just say it exacerbated the gender gap and set back kind of a timeline for achieving gender parity. That it really disproportionately hit women who work more in the services sector, who had more, of the child responsibilities, and were unable to work, and were unable to, kind of, let's just say, take care of other folks in their family as well. But when I look at COVID, I like to remind people, I think one kind of shining light for women is that digitization has really accelerated. And in particular, when I look ahead, I think there will be more flexibility in the workplace than there was during my career. I mean, now what COVID showed, that you could work remotely from home, you could, do conference calls, you could lead meetings, and that almost it had to become the norm for about 2 years. And I know, in some societies, people are going back to work a lot quicker, but in the United States, I would argue it really has an impact on work. And I think hybrid work is kind of the future. And I'm hoping that through all of this and through the flexibilities that have been created through remote work, that will help equalize the gender gap.
Thank you, Wendy. Let me actually come to you, Wenchi. What's in it for the future?
For women's empowerment?
Yeah.
For the future? That's a big question. I think in an ideal world, right, I would hope one day that we don't have to talk about women's empowerment. It's just happening, right? You don't have to make it a special issue. And it's just a norm. I know right now it's still, we have a long way to go. That's why even this conference, we still want to talk about women as an issue. And I myself have been working on, gender women for so long. And sometimes I feel like I'm very cynical about, all the things we're talking about, because you feel like, oh my God, we're not making enough progress, or, there's some 2 steps, forward and then 1 step back, or even 2 steps back. But I would say what's giving me hope is actually our male allies and our male partners. A lot of people are on our side. And again, I'm not using the language as sort of, us and them, but more sort of the younger generation of men and people in general are more open-minded and are willing to actually think about those issues. Now, my father's generation, I'm not saying he is, discriminatory or something. It just doesn't come naturally when confronted with those issues. So I think that is progress we're seeing. Now, comes down to, are we pushing it too aggressively, and therefore there may be some pushback? I'm seeing some of that in certain parts of society as well, right? So people have asked me, okay, you guys always talk about women's rights. We want to talk about men's rights too. Men feel threatened, and, how come nobody, especially, in certain part of America, there's white men feel that they're disadvantaged in many ways. So I think at the end of the day, it's not about women or men. It's not about any particular race or ethnicity or anything. It's more of a balance, right? How do we want to have the power, I would say, distributed and shared in a way that society feels comfortable, and then we can move forward together, not one overpowering the other that makes anyone feel threatened and insecure. And that is a hard balance to strike. But I think we're all trying.
Thank you, Wenchi, for your wisdom. So finally, Tamao-san?
Yes, I think women empowerment continues to be the important theme. In Japan, in the last 20 years, I think I've seen certainly a progress, always more to be done. As Claire said, I was quite shocked to hear that 397 were men and 3 were women, and even at a global company like Itochu. But that's still the reality. But, it's good that government's pushing, the private sectors are pushing, and I've seen the behavioral changes as well in the corporate side. So clearly more to be done, but we have to keep pushing. I think it's a common goals. As Wendy said, depending on the countries, there are a different set of issues and different nuances in doing so. But I certainly would like to give it back. The more do it, I think the better the society gets. So thank you.
Thank you, Tamao. I think we have until 10:15. Is that correct? Yes? Okay. So according to my clock, we have 7 minutes for Q questions. Let me actually go from the back, because the back people are always sort of neglected. You in the very back, right in front of the camera. The blonde man. Waving, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the insights. Wendy, this one's for you, and you could probably answer this all week, but what would be your top 3 negotiating tips, particularly when your counterpart feels as though being at the negotiating table they don't even need to be there to begin with? What are your 3 tips? Can you quickly
tell us your name and your class?
Sure. My name's James Griffin, and I'm from Australia, and I'm the Minister for Environment.
Okay. Wendy.
So 3. Can I just ask once more, because you said particularly when your counterpart I couldn't.
Don't feel that they should be negotiating to begin with. So they're very reluctant to be at the table anyway.
Okay. So, you know, there's lots of negotiating tips. And one thing when I talk about negotiation to anyone, I just say, like, everyone's got to find their own styles. But some things that I think are important are picking your battles, okay? Not everything can be important, okay? Everyone has a finite amount of time and finite amount of issues they can work on. And I think, and I've seen this over and over, that younger folks at the negotiating table, they just want to argue about everything. And once you become more seasoned, you know, you figure out that, you know what, we're better off focusing on certain things. Now, this doesn't mean that you tell your counterpart exactly what you need, but because, you know, there's always an advantage to kind of keeping them off guard and not telling them everything that's on your mind. But I think picking battles is important. I think really listening and respecting your counterpart is extremely important. Americans in particular, I've seen at the negotiating table, we love to talk. We're not great at listening. And listening is so important, not only to show that you respect the other side, but also, if you're really listening, a lot of times you can figure out that it's easier to find common ground, because by what they say or what they don't say can give you clues about how you can kind of, what I would call, draft around their concerns. And finally, I just, you know, when it comes to like being a woman at the negotiating table, one of my tips for women always is just like, don't personalize everything. And, you know, I've been in a lot of negotiations where my male counterparts have just been ruthless and, you know, very insulting. And, you know, when I was younger, I remember at one negotiation with the Japanese, and my counterpart was so mean to me, and we had plans for dinner that night. And I just assumed, you know, after this session, I'm not going anywhere near him. And he came up to me after the session, and he was nice as nice could be. And it really hit me then. This had nothing to do with me. He probably needed to kind of show, you know, the folks sitting next to him how tough he was. And it just wasn't personal. And so for women in particular, but, you know, some men do this too, it's not all about you at the table, and you kind of need to be able to kind of take it and pick your battles and kind of let certain things slide off you, but obviously, you know, intervene and interject when you need to.
Thank you so much. So let me actually do this now. Let me actually congregate some of the questions. So one, you, the woman wearing a black mask. The next person, Chuck in the front, and then you in a blue sweater. Yes. So let's get those three questions in a row.
Thank you all for sharing your journeys. And my question is about mentorship. Wenchi, I also was in the Vital Voices program, and one of the programs is a global mentoring walk. And so we do this in my community in the Philippines. We match mentors and mentees. And the one day that they do it is always great, but then we encourage our mentors, especially when they're my staff, to continue the relationship, and they usually don't because they don't have time. And, you know, I was just wondering, given how busy everybody is and how much work everybody has, what are some of the specific things that each of you have done to kind of nurture and mentor women on your teams? And, you know, given the fact that it takes time, and I'm also kind of wondering how many of your mentorship relationships just kind of informally happen over time versus you actually making up an intentional point to kind of be someone's mentor. And so this is kind of like a little bit different from actual programs, but just, you know, all the men and women in the room who manage teams, like what are some of the things that we can do to actually nurture and mentor the people who work with us?
Okay, thank you. Chuck?
Yeah, hey, thank you very much for a very insightful session. I just wanted to, from a men's perspective, not that we intentionally don't want to help women, but I think sometimes we overlook those things. And so I wanted, from your perspective, what are some of the things specifically targeted to men, for instance, right? And I think, Tamao, you mentioned about, be a champion, right? What does that mean in terms of being champion? And we'd love to hear from some perspectives on that.
Thank you. Next person.
Kia ora, Nikura Ngaropo from New Zealand, class of 2019. My question was, you're all incredibly successful. As you move up the chain in terms of leadership, the people and the circles that you have to support you get smaller and smaller. Who do you turn to and who do you talk to as you're rising up that ladder? Especially being for our women on the panel who are of Asian descent as well. How has that been in environments that aren't Asian?
Okay, so I hope the Asia Society will give me 5 extra minutes. And if you can touch upon any one of those 3, each one of you very quickly, we have until 10:20. And then the rest of you who had additional questions, please come up to us during the break. Okay.
Sorry, what was the last question? I couldn't really quite understand.
The first part was being successful, who do you talk to? In terms like the leadership journey is really lonely when you start getting to the top of your game. Who are those people that you turn to for advice? And the other one was being a woman of Asian descent in spaces that may not be full of Asian people. How is that, and how do you navigate that space?
Okay, so if I can ask for quick responses.
Well, quickly on mentorship and champion, I think they're related, right? I think one thing is we all need to be very smart about using others' time, right? Being very strategic about it, whether you're a mentor yourself or people see you as a mentor. So why are you allocating 30 minutes or an hour of time of your day to do certain things, right? You have to think about why and think in their shoes, why do they want to do that for you? So, and this is also, learned process, because I used to think, it would be so great if someone can talk to me and give me a mentoring session. But then now, gradually, increasingly, what I learned is that you need to add value to them as well. Why are they spending time talking to you? So make your question interesting and value added to that as well. So people feel like, okay, I'm actually investing in someone that has a future, because everybody wants to be part of someone's future success. I mean, that's human nature. So rather than feeling like I'm just giving to something and investing in something that may not have any return, of course, that's completely altruistic as well, but thinking rationally, and especially for really, really busy people, why would they do that? So think about how you can add value and interesting perspectives to their life as well. Usually it's helping them learn about something that it is in their realm of work that they may value as well. So then they would be willing and interested in giving you more time. And that relationship is not one way, but more two-way as well.
Thank you, Wenchi. So the question from the gentleman, whom do you talk to? I guess is going to be the last question for this panel.
Okay, who do I talk to?
When you are seeking advice.
Yeah, who do I talk to? So you're right, exactly, because the crowd gets smaller and smaller for sure. So I do talk to my sponsor and mentor. Fortunately, I had various mentors as I was progressing my career. So I do that, and then those mentors are within. Actually used to be in the company, but now the person is doing all sorts of things outside of the company. And the sponsor is somebody who can be your mentor, but the sponsor is somebody who really helped you elevate your career in your organization. But I do want to come back to one point because you asked about sustaining relationship mentor-mentee. I did a Vital Voice Global Ambassador Program as a mentor. So I do keep in touch every year. The person does sustainable living clothing shops. So what I do is to make sure that my friends and people that I believe in it would go visit her and talk about the progress that the person's making. So I think it's a continuous of relationships, and it's such a pleasure to do that. But thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you so much, you guys, for participating in this panel. Thank you very much, the panelists, for your wisdom, great wisdom. Let's continue this conversation during the break and afterwards as well. So thank you.